The avoidant thought losing you would feel like freedom. That's the illusion. That's the story they tell themselves in the beginning. They convince themselves that distance will bring relief, that detachment will restore control, that walking away from emotional responsibility somehow equals peace. And for a short period of time, it even appears true. The pressure disappears. The conversations stop. The vulnerability fades. There's no one asking difficult questions anymore. No one expecting emotional presence, honesty, or consistency. To the avoidant mind, that silence can initially feel like liberation. But what they mistake for freedom is often just emotional numbness. You have to understand something about avoidant psychology. Avoidants are not running from love itself. They are running from what love exposes inside them. Real intimacy forces a person to confront fear, insecurity, shame, dependency, rejection, and unresolved emotional wounds. And when someone truly loves them, deeply, consistently, unconditionally, it creates an emotional mirror they cannot easily escape. Suddenly, they are seen. Suddenly, their patterns become visible. Suddenly, emotional distance no longer protects them the way it once did. So instead of leaning into growth, many avoidants retreat. They pull away. They sabotage. Sometimes they betray the very person who loved them most because betrayal creates distance faster than honesty ever could. It gives them an exit route. It restores emotional space, or at least that's what they believe. But here's the part they never anticipate. The nervous system can confuse peace with emptiness for a while, but eventually the truth catches up. Because once the noise dies down, once the distractions stop working, once the ego no longer has an audience, they are left alone with themselves. And that is the moment the illusion collapses. They begin to realize that the person they escaped from was actually the person grounding them emotionally. The love they resisted was the very thing stabilizing their life. Your presence gave them safety, consistency, emotional reassurance, and meaning, things they may not even have known how to value while they had them. Human beings rarely understand the importance of emotional safety until they lose it. And now the freedom they fought for starts feeling strangely empty. The late nights feel quieter. Success feels less satisfying. Conversations feel superficial. New connections lack depth. They search for stimulation, validation, distraction, but nothing truly replaces the emotional certainty of being genuinely understood. Because deep down, every human being wants connection, even the ones terrified of it. This is why avoidants often feel the loss later instead of sooner. Their defense mechanisms delay the pain, but they do not erase it. Eventually, reality arrives. And when it does, they are forced to confront the hardest truth of all. They did not lose their freedom when they loved you. They lost their freedom the moment fear began controlling their life. And there is no heavier prison than becoming a stranger to your own heart. One of the deepest ironies in human psychology is that people often do not recognize the value of something while it is still consistently available to them. Familiarity creates emotional blindness. What once felt extraordinary slowly becomes expected, and what is expected is rarely appreciated with the intensity it deserves. This happens in relationships all the time, but it becomes especially destructive in the mind of the avoidant. The avoidant underestimated your value because your love became predictable. Your patience became routine. Your loyalty became assumed. The emotional safety you created became something they unconsciously relied on without fully acknowledging. You answered the calls. You stayed during difficult moments. You tried to understand them instead of attacking them. You gave reassurance when they pulled away. And because you kept showing up, they slowly stopped seeing the rarity of what they had. Human beings have a dangerous tendency to mistake stability for insignificance. The avoidant often convinces themselves that they can always find another connection, another relationship, another person willing to love them. In their mind, your presence feels replaceable because they measure relationships through emotional intensity instead of emotional depth. They chase novelty, temporary excitement, surface-level chemistry, or the illusion of independence without realizing that genuine emotional security is one of the rarest experiences a person can ever encounter. And the tragedy is this: people rarely recognize emotional safety while they are inside it. They only recognize it once chaos replaces it. After the betrayal, after the distance, after the separation, reality begins teaching lessons the ego refused to learn. The avoidant enters new conversations, new relationships, new environments, but something feels different. The connection lacks substance. The understanding feels shallow. The loyalty feels uncertain. Suddenly they begin comparing everyone to the person they once took for granted. That is when your value becomes undeniable. Not because you were perfect, not because relationships are flawless, but because authentic connection carries a psychological weight that cannot easily be replicated. You knew how to calm them, You understood their silence. You recognized their emotional patterns. You offered consistency in a world filled with conditional attention and temporary attachment. And once that disappears, they discover how emotionally expensive it is to lose someone who genuinely cared. This is why regret often arrives slowly for avoidants. Their emotional defenses delay awareness. At first, distraction protects them. Pride protects them. Ego protects them. But time has a way of removing illusions. Eventually, they begin replaying memories differently. The moments they once minimized suddenly feel significant. The love they once resisted now feels irreplaceable. And here is the painful truth they must face. Your value did not increase after you left. Your value was always there. Their awareness finally caught up to reality. That realization changes people. Because nothing humbles the human ego faster than discovering too late that the person you treated as ordinary was actually extraordinary. And some losses do not teach you because they hurt. They teach you because they reveal what you were blind enough to destroy. What many people fail to understand about avoidance is that emotional independence is often a performance, not a reality. Beneath the distance, beneath the withdrawal, beneath the need for control, there is still a human being with emotional needs they may not fully know how to express. Avoidants spend so much of their lives convincing themselves they do not need deep connection, that they eventually start believing their own defense mechanisms. But the human nervous system does not stop craving safety simply because the mind fears vulnerability. And that is why betrayal becomes so psychologically destructive for them. When an avoidant betrays someone who genuinely loved them, they are not just damaging a relationship. They are destroying one of the few emotionally safe spaces they secretly depended on. The tragedy is that they often realize this only after the connection is gone. While the relationship exists, they focus on the pressure of intimacy. After it ends, they begin feeling the absence of emotional security. That absence changes people, because deep down, even avoidants want to feel understood without being judged. They want connection without losing autonomy. They want love without the fear of emotional exposure. And when someone actually gives them that patience, understanding, loyalty, emotional steadiness, it creates a level of safety their nervous system quietly attaches to over time. But betrayal contaminates that safety. Once they cross that line, something inside them shifts psychologically. Even if they never admit it publicly, the mind understands when it has violated trust. Human beings are wired for internal moral awareness. You can suppress guilt intellectually, but emotionally it still leaves traces. It appears in unexpected moments: difficulty sleeping, emotional irritability, restlessness, anxiety, emptiness, loss of motivation, emotional detachment, even self-destructive behavior. The person may not consciously connect all of it to the betrayal, but internally, the nervous system knows something valuable was damaged. This is why avoidants often become even more emotionally distant after hurting someone. People assume they stopped caring. Sometimes the opposite is true. The guilt becomes so uncomfortable that avoidance increases as a defense mechanism. Distance becomes a way to escape accountability. If they fully slowed down and emotionally processed what they destroyed, they would have to confront painful truths about themselves, truths they may have spent years avoiding. And here is the deeper philosophical reality. Betrayal does not only wound the person who was hurt, it also fractures the identity of the person committing it, because every action shapes self-perception. When someone repeatedly violates their own values, they slowly lose trust in themselves. Confidence weakens, inner peace weakens, emotional clarity weakens. This is why some avoidants appear emotionally numb after betrayal. They are disconnected not only from others, but from themselves. And eventually they begin realizing something painful. The relationship was not suffocating them the way they once believed. In many ways, it was stabilizing them. Your loyalty created emotional grounding they did not know how to appreciate until its absence forced them to feel life without it. That is the hidden consequence of betrayal. The avoidant thought they were protecting themselves from vulnerability, but in reality they were destroying the very connection their soul had been searching for all along. Because the greatest damage betrayal creates is not always the loss of another person, sometimes it is the slow collapse of the person you become afterward. One of the most powerful moments in any broken relationship is not the argument, not the betrayal, not even the separation itself. It is the moment one person becomes silent, not bitter, not reactive, not begging for answers, just emotionally gone. Because silence has a psychological weight that words can never fully carry. And for the avoidant, your silence often becomes the loudest consequence they have ever experienced. While you were chasing clarity, trying to fix the connection, explaining your pain, asking for honesty, or fighting to keep the relationship alive, the avoidant still had something protecting them from reality: your presence. Even conflict can create emotional comfort because it reassures a person that the bond still exists. As long as you continued reaching out, there was still emotional access to you. There was still reassurance that you cared. But when that disappears, something shifts internally. The avoidant expects anger. They expect emotional reactions. They expect pursuit. What they often do not expect is acceptance. They do not expect the day you finally stop trying to convince someone to value you correctly. And when that day comes, the emotional dynamic changes completely. Because now there is no distraction left. No emotional noise to hide behind. No constant communication covering the deeper truth. Only silence. And silence forces confrontation. You see, avoidants survive psychologically through distance and distraction. They stay busy. They intellectualize emotions. They minimize attachment. They convince themselves that time will erase consequences. But silence removes the external stimulation they relied on to avoid internal reflection. Suddenly, they are left alone with their own thoughts, their own memories, and their own decisions. That is why your absence becomes emotionally louder over time. The human mind adapts quickly to what is constantly available, but it obsesses over what suddenly disappears. Neuroscience even shows that emotional uncertainty activates the brain more intensely than predictable outcomes. When you finally withdraw your energy completely, the avoidant begins experiencing a loss of emotional control they never anticipated. They can no longer predict your feelings. They can no longer assume your availability. They can no longer quietly rely on your emotional loyalty in the background of their life. And this creates something deeply uncomfortable: awareness. Now they remember the small things: your consistency, your voice, your emotional presence, the way you tried to understand them even when they struggled to understand themselves. The mind starts replaying moments it once ignored because silence creates space for reflection. And reflection is dangerous for anyone who has spent years outrunning themselves. This is why many avoidants feel the breakup emotionally much later. Your silence removes the protective illusion that they can simply move on unaffected. Eventually, they realize they are not grieving the loss of attention. They are grieving the loss of emotional certainty, the quiet comfort of knowing someone genuinely cared. And here is the deeper truth: your silence is not powerful because it punishes them. It is powerful because it reveals reality without interference. For the first time, they are forced to experience life without your emotional safety cushioning their choices. Sometimes the loudest thing a person will ever hear is the silence that follows losing someone who truly loved them. Because absence has a way of teaching lessons that words never could. After the relationship ends, the avoidant often enters a phase that looks convincing from the outside. They appear detached, functional, sometimes even happier. They throw themselves into work, distractions, social validation, new experiences, or even new relationships. And to the people observing from a distance, it may seem like they moved on effortlessly. But what most people do not understand is that avoidants are experts at delaying emotional processing. Delaying pain is not the same thing as escaping it. At first, freedom feels exciting because it removes emotional pressure. There is no vulnerability demanding accountability anymore. No intimacy exposing hidden fears. No relationship forcing them to confront emotional limitations. The avoidant finally regains what they value most on the surface: space. But space without meaning eventually becomes emptiness. This is where life begins teaching lessons the ego could never understand while comfort still existed. Because eventually the distractions lose intensity. The novelty fades. The temporary excitement of new people becomes repetitive. Conversations begin feeling shallow. Connections feel transactional. The emotional depth they once resisted suddenly becomes difficult to replace. And this is when many avoidants begin realizing something profound. Real love is extraordinarily rare. Not attraction, not chemistry, not temporary obsession. Real love. Real love is not built on adrenaline. It is built on emotional safety, on consistency, on loyalty, on the ability to remain emotionally present even during discomfort. It is the rare experience of being fully seen while still being accepted. And many avoidants do not understand the value of that kind of connection until they attempt to recreate it elsewhere and discover how uncommon it actually is. Because most people can offer attention, very few can offer genuine emotional stability. The avoidant eventually notices that the people entering their life after you may provide entertainment, distraction, validation, or surface-level excitement, but something essential is missing. The conversations do not reach the same depth. The trust does not feel the same. The emotional understanding feels incomplete. And slowly, almost painfully, comparison begins happening automatically. Not because you were flawless, but because authentic connection leaves psychological fingerprints that are impossible to erase completely. Your patience during difficult moments, your emotional consistency, your effort to understand rather than judge, the way you created safety during chaos. Those things become more valuable in retrospect because life teaches people through contrast. They only fully recognize emotional peace after experiencing emotional emptiness. And this realization becomes even heavier for avoidants because they understand, at least privately, that they participated in destroying the very thing they now miss. That creates a unique kind of regret. Not just grief over losing someone, but grief mixed with responsibility. Psychologically, this is where many avoidants begin confronting existential questions they spent years suppressing. Questions about why they sabotage closeness, why vulnerability feels threatening, why they push away the people who love them most. Because eventually they reach a painful conclusion. The issue was never simply the relationship. The issue was the unresolved fear operating inside them. And once that awareness arrives, the loss changes meaning completely. Now it is no longer just about missing a person. It becomes about recognizing the magnitude of what was lost. They understand that real love is not guaranteed to appear multiple times in life. Genuine emotional compatibility is rare. Deep trust is rare. Loyalty is rare. A connection where someone truly understands your mind, your wounds, your silence, your patterns, that is rare beyond words. This is why some avoidants carry regret for years, because they eventually discover that replacing a person is easy. Replacing a genuine emotional connection is almost impossible, and life has a brutal way of teaching this lesson. Sometimes it allows you to meet someone extraordinary, only to reveal later that you were too emotionally unprepared to keep them. That realization humbles people in ways success, pride, and distraction never can, because nothing exposes emotional immaturity faster than losing the one connection that made life feel real. In the end, the avoidant eventually comes face to face with a truth that is almost impossible to outrun forever. The greatest punishment was never losing the relationship alone. The greatest punishment was becoming the person responsible for losing it. That realization changes everything, because human beings can survive heartbreak. People survive separation every day. What is much harder to live with is self-awareness, especially when that awareness reveals that fear, ego, emotional immaturity, or unresolved wounds caused you to destroy something meaningful with your own hands. At first, the avoidant spends a great deal of energy protecting their narrative. They justify the distance. They rationalize the betrayal. They focus on your flaws, the conflicts, the emotional pressure, the imperfections inside the relationship. This is how the ego protects itself from guilt. The mind always searches for explanations that reduce responsibility because responsibility forces emotional discomfort. But time weakens emotional defenses, and eventually life becomes quieter. The distractions lose power. The external validation stops filling the emptiness. The pride that once felt protective begins feeling isolating. And somewhere in the silence, clarity starts arriving in pieces. Not all at once, but slowly, painfully. Honestly, they begin realizing you were not asking for perfection. You were asking for honesty, for effort, for emotional presence, for consistency. The things they once interpreted as pressure were often simply the normal requirements of a healthy connection. But because unresolved fear controlled them internally, love itself began feeling threatening. This is one of the most important psychological truths people must understand. Unresolved wounds distort perception. An avoidant can interpret genuine intimacy as danger because vulnerability activates old emotional survival patterns. Instead of seeing love as safety, they experience it as risk. Instead of moving closer, they pull away. Instead of communicating fear openly, they sabotage connection indirectly. And sabotage always creates consequences. Eventually, the avoidant reaches a point where they can no longer blame timing, circumstances, stress, or incompatibility for what happened. Deep down, they know the truth. They know they hurt someone who genuinely cared for them. They know they abandoned emotional responsibility when it mattered most. And perhaps most painfully of all, they know the relationship may not have failed because love was absent. It may have failed because fear was stronger. That realization can haunt a person for years, because now the loss becomes deeply personal. It is no longer just I lost someone, it becomes I became someone incapable of protecting what mattered most. And that creates a fracture in identity itself. Human beings need to believe they are good, trustworthy, emotionally capable people. When actions contradict that self-image, inner conflict begins developing beneath the surface. This is why regret becomes so psychologically heavy. Regret is not just sadness about the past. Regret is the collision between who you thought you were and what your choices revealed about you. And for many avoidants, this becomes the beginning of either transformation or emotional collapse. Some people finally confront themselves honestly. They begin healing old wounds. They develop emotional awareness. They learn accountability. They stop running from intimacy. Pain becomes a catalyst for growth. But others remain trapped inside avoidance, repeating the same cycle with different people, carrying silent regret into every future connection. Because until someone confronts the fear inside them, they will continue sabotaging the very love they crave. And this is the final irony in the avoidance journey. The person they feared losing control around was often the person who loved them most authentically. The intimacy they resisted was the very thing capable of helping them heal. But fear convinced them to protect themselves from the one connection that required them to grow. Life eventually teaches all of us the same lesson. Love does not destroy people. Fear does. And there is no heavier burden than realizing too late that the greatest loss in your life was created by the version of yourself you refused to confront. So when you step back and look at the entire story, you begin to realize this was never simply about one relationship ending. It was about the collision between love and fear, between emotional truth and emotional avoidance, between the person who was willing to grow through connection and the person who kept running from themselves. The avoidant believed betrayal would protect them. They believed distance would give them control, freedom, relief, and peace. But over time, life revealed something far deeper. You cannot find peace by destroying the very connection that brought meaning into your life. You cannot heal emotional wounds by avoiding intimacy. And you cannot build a fulfilling life while fear is making your decisions for you. That is the tragedy of avoidance. The avoidant underestimated your value because your love felt constant. They sabotaged emotional safety because vulnerability frightened them. They mistook silence for strength, independence for healing, and emotional detachment for power. But eventually, reality caught up. Your absence became louder than any argument. The connection they thought they could replace became impossible to recreate. And the freedom they chased slowly turned into emptiness. Because real love is rare. Not perfect love, not fantasy. Real love, the kind built on loyalty, understanding, emotional safety, patience, and truth. The kind of connection that calms the nervous system and gives people the courage to become better versions of themselves. That kind of love does not appear every day. And when someone destroys it out of fear, the consequences are not always immediate, but they are lasting. But there is also a lesson here for you. Never measure your value by someone's inability to recognize it in the moment. People trapped in avoidance often cannot appreciate healthy love until they are forced to experience life without it. Their blindness was never proof that you lacked value. It was proof that unresolved fear was controlling their perception. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to convince someone to choose you correctly. Because your purpose is not to shrink yourself to fit inside another person's emotional limitations. Your purpose is to grow, heal, evolve, and protect your peace. Let people face the consequences of the choices they made. Let silence reveal what words never could. Let absence teach what love tried desperately to teach gently. At the end of the day, every human being faces the same decision. Live from fear or live from truth. Fear sabotages. Fear avoids. Fear betrays. Fear runs, but truth transforms. And the people who finally heal are not the ones who never made mistakes. They are the ones courageous enough to confront themselves honestly before life forces them to do it painfully. Because in the end, the avoidant did not lose their life because you left. They lost it the moment fear became more important than love.